So good morning or good afternoon to everyone who's joined us to this session. Thank you for taking part in this policy dialogue series at this seminar specifically on transportation for equity and social mobility. Just to explain a little bit about policy dialogues, they're a series that are organized by the Johns Hopkins University and University Pompeu Fabra Public Policy Center, which is also in collaboration with UPF Barcelona School of Management. And these seminars aim to really make knowledge around policy making and its impact on people's quality of life and well-being and equity, to make this knowledge more accessible to a wider audience. And if you're interested in knowing more about these policy dialogues, we actually have, you can see a lot of the previous sessions have been recorded and they're available on the center's YouTube channel as well. And there's also an Instagram page as well, if you would like to follow that. I'm Lucinda Cash-Gibson. I'm a senior lecturer and researcher affiliated to the center, and I work specifically in the areas of health inequalities and urban environments and health. And I will be moderating today's session. And so discussing today's topic on transportation for equity and social mobility, I'm delighted that we have two guest speakers today. So Johnathon Ehsani and Sara Bailac, they'll both be giving a nice complementary introduction to the topic and also sort of giving a mix of academic and policy and practice perspectives. So we're very complementary. Johnathon is an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberry School of Public Health in the Department of Health Policy and Management in the US. And his research uses policy and behavioral research to prevent motorcycle crashes and advance the health promoting aspects of transportation with a specific focus on equity and social mobility. And Sara is the Catalan senator and spokeswoman for Esquerra Republicana de Catalunya in the Spanish Senate. She has worked on developing transportation infrastructure policies in Catalonia here, with a focus on reducing geographical inequalities through transportation systems, particularly between the center and peripheral regions. And just to get a little bit of an overview of the format, so Johnathon will be presenting first, and he will be discussing the impact of licensing systems and policies on mobility and their impact on health and education and employment, giving some case studies focused on in the US. And then Sara will be presenting and sharing some examples of what's been done in Catalonia in recent years to try to achieve greater geographical equity through transport systems. And each presentation will last 20 minutes. Then we'll have a brief reflection, and the presenters can also reflect on each other's presentations. And then we will go for a Q&A with the audience, and you can ask some questions related to the topic. So I will hand over now to Johnathon. So you can have your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucinda, and welcome. A special thank you to those who have joined, and I want to also acknowledge our friends from Luxembourg, in particular from the Liza Institute, who are doing great work in this area. So thank you very much for being here. So I want you to just maybe, we've been given 20 minutes, and I'm going to do my very best not to go over that. But I think there's really, if you could take away three things that I'm going to share with you, is that transportation, or three big ideas. The first is that transportation is a very important contributor to health. I think that's the first really big idea. The second one is that our policies outside of the transportation sector sometimes, and sometimes within, can impact people's mobility and then therefore health. Okay, so the first one is transportation is a huge kind of corollary of health. Policies and things that we adopt can have an impact on transportation and health. And the third is that we can make things better. And so the case studies that I'm going to present to you are a demonstration of that. And I'm going to do my best to keep this very high level. I will add that these experiences and these examples are from the United States context. One of them I'll be sharing with you is a state level licensing policy for driver licenses for teenagers. And the second is a local city policy around the geographic distribution of micromobility. So those are the two kind of case studies that I'm going to be offering you today. So with that, let's kick off. Okay, so hopefully you can all see this, and yeah, terrific. Okay, let's go. So my premise or my thesis today is that transportation policy is a key to upward mobility, and this term upward mobility has a particular meaning that it's kind of it's a conduit to unlock opportunities and access to things in life where the condition of the individual and the collective improves. And so you can think of this as social upward mobility. So the first big idea that I've already shared with you is that these things on the screen that you're seeing here, these items, education, healthcare, our neighborhoods and built environment, our social and community context, and our economic stability. What's one thing? These are all called the social determinants of health. The social determinants of health. You can think of this as things that we do, particularly education, our neighborhoods, our social and community context, and economic stability, as things outside of the healthcare system, that have a direct impact on our health. And what's the one thing that kind of ties all of these together? Well, my premise or my thesis to you today is that it's transportation. Transportation is a key contributor to the social determinants of health. It's not just one of the social determinants of health like education or the neighborhood and built environment. It's actually the conduit to all of these. So it's an enabler for all of these social determinants of health. So this isn't just my idea. There is now kind of a growing conversation in the US and in other jurisdictions where people are talking about mobility almost like a basic guarantee or basic necessity or basic right. And so there are jurisdictions in the United States, cities and states, that are kind of debating whether or not people should be given a universal mobility allowance, for example, and I think we're going to hear more about this as time proceeds. So here's one example that in the city of Pittsburgh has a innovative mobility and equity initiative that was really around this universal basic mobility pilot. Sometimes these are stood up in the form of vouchers for specific types of transportation, and sometimes they're given as a cash allowance to be used for mobility. Sometimes some cities will do this with ride sharing, for example. Others will do this with public transit. And of course, many of you will be aware of the incredible work happening in several jurisdictions, including Luxembourg, around free public transit, which is another kind of conduit or initiative along these lines. So the first thing I'm going to talk to you about is driver licensing policy. And let me just start off by saying this. Driver licensing policy wouldn't, on first blush, appear to be something that's linked to the social determinants of health. Okay, when you think about driver licensing policy, it's a little bit boring. You think about taking an eyesight test. You think about maybe going and renewing something in a very old building, and someone looks across from you from a hallway and they say something and you say something and you pay some money and you walk away, you have a driver's license. Well, it turns out driver licensing policy is actually very important for our social, as a social determinant of health and our broader health. Let me give you an example. A debate that has been raging actually across the world and will continue to kind of evolve is the question of when do you take the license away from an older person? When someone is, say, for example, 65 or 70 or 75 in various states in the United States, for example, you have to begin going to the driver licensing office once every year, once every 2 years, every 5 years. You may have to take a driving test and so on. And we know from a number of empirical studies that when you take an older person's driver license away, they experience a range or a cascade of negative health outcomes. Why? Why does that happen? Because you've taken away their independence and their mobility, especially in the United States, where really the transportation system is heavily reliant on the privately owned motor vehicle. Now, this wouldn't be the case if you lived in New York City, for example, but pretty much everywhere else. Pretty much everywhere else, you need a car to get around and get things done. So if you take a driver's license away from an older adult, well, guess what? Their health begins to deteriorate. They're more socially isolated. They become depressed, and you know, a cascade of things follows suit. However, that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about teenagers, because I think for a long time we assumed that driver's licensing policy for young people was kind of like a neutral topic. We had it figured out, so to speak, you know. But it turns out that we don't, and I want to kind of elaborate on this a little bit. So you can think of the driving license population as people inside a giant tent. So in the United States, there's about 220 million people inside this tent, right? 220 million people. And a couple of million people come into this tent every year, and they're the new drivers. And then a couple of million people go out of this tent every year at the other end of this tent, and they're the older drivers. And now it matters, because of what I mentioned before, how big or small do you make these doors to get in and out of this tent? Well, that's really what we're talking about here in terms of social policy. When we think about driver licensing, it's really about the doors to get in and out of this tent. And when you're in this tent, you've kind of got access to legally drive. But when you're not in this tent, you know, it's basically associated with some negative outcomes, which I'm going to articulate to you in a moment. So my premise here for you today is that the goal of the licensing system should be twofold. It should be to maximize people's mobility and optimize their safety. Now, you might be thinking, Jonathan, it's 5 p.m. in Europe. I want to go home and have my dinner. Why are you telling me obvious things about the licensing system, that it should maximize mobility and optimize safety? Well, the reason I'm saying this to you is because actually not many people agree with this statement. If you go into the United States right now, into a state driver licensing department, and you'd ask the administrator, the head person of that licensing division, what are the goals of your licensing agency? They'll say probably it's to maximize mobility. They won't say anything about safety. Mobility is seen as the enabler for economic opportunity and production. And therefore, the focus in the driver licensing system has been historically on mobility, on enabling mobility. The safety people, to be, you know, blunt, were an afterthought. When people started dying, when there were horrific crashes, when prominent people's children would be killed in car crashes, the safety conversation began. And about 30 years ago in the United States, a new idea kind of was adopted called graduated driver licensing. And graduated driver licensing is not new. It's really a staged licensing system that was adopted as a policy innovation from New Zealand, would you believe? And then it's now used widely in Australia, and in almost every state of the United States. But basically, what a graduated driver licensing system looks like is that there's a driver education component. Most states have, about 30 or so states have a requirement where you have to go into a class, you have to pay some money, and someone tells you, okay, this is how you hold the steering wheel, this is how you turn on your windshield wipers and all. But then there are other things. There are other things that people need to do. And one of them, a significant one, is this. Once you pass your knowledge test, this is just kind of like, you know, what does this sign mean and so on, then you have to hold your learner permit for a period of time, typically 6 or 9 months. And during that time, you have to complete a certain number of hours of practice driving, usually with your mom and dad or someone else who knows how to drive. And the requirement for those hours can be quite onerous. In the state of Maine, for example, you need to practice 70 hours with someone who's got a driver's license. In New South Wales, in Australia, it's 120 hours. And so those requirements become quite burdensome for families, if you can imagine the need to practice that many hours. And then finally, there are some intermediate license requirements where once you get your license to drive on your own, you can't drive, for example, with your car full of your friends. You have to drive either on your own or only with your brother and sister, and you can't drive late at night and so on. And so initial evaluations of graduated driver licensing, and here's an example, forgive me, of New York's graduated driver licensing requirements. And so here you see the minimum entry age is 16. The holding period that I said you have to practice was 6 months, and you have to do 50 hours of practice. And then once you get your license, you have these other restrictions and so on. So this is the case for almost every state in the country. And graduated driver licensing systems are widely adopted. These are the nighttime and passenger restrictions, for example. And when we look at the evaluations of graduated driver licensing, you know, those components that I was articulating a moment ago. I said, you know, how many hours you need to practice, how long you have to hold your license, how many friends you can have, and all of those can be thought of as individual components. So the more of those components that you have, it looks like the effect on fatal crashes for 16 and 17-year-olds goes ways down. So if in a state where there's you know, a comprehensive graduated driver licensing program where there's 6 or 7 of these components, there's a significant reduction in 16 and 17-year-olds crashes. And there's some debate about why this happens, about which policies are most effective. And this is a question we tried to answer with some evaluation that we did. So in one study that we conducted now many moons ago, we looked at the length of time people needed to hold their license. And we found that, well, actually, it turns out that this does have a significant association with reduced fatal crashes. The longer you hold your learner license, when we looked at the states that introduced this requirement one at a time in kind of a natural policy experiment, we saw that the pooled effect in a meta-analysis was indeed protective. It was below zero. However, there's another element of graduated driver licensing, which is how many hours you practice with your mom and dad. You can imagine all of these parents sitting in the car with their kids, practicing, the kids getting frustrated, mom and dad is getting scared, all of that stuff. Well, it turns out when you do an evaluation of that, it has no protective effect. And the more we looked at this from different ways, the more we kept finding that, in fact, the required number of hours that people are practicing aren't having an effect on fatal crashes among 16 and 17-year-olds. And there could be a number of reasons why this is the case. Probably one of them is that people aren't practicing the full amount. And also the quality of the practice that they're getting is not maybe as good. But then there's other more complex reasons that, you know, the types of crashes that this practice might prevent may not be the most severe crashes. So it could also have something to do with the outcome variable that we chose. So anyway, but in the collective, if I could jog your memory here, back to this original slide here, we saw that the overall effect of graduated driver licensing, when you look at it in its totality, was extremely effective. However, one thing that I failed to mention to you is that it only applies to 16 and 17-year-old drivers. The moment you turn 18, none of this matters. The moment you're an adult, 18, you go to the licensing agency, you say, hi, I'm 18, I'm here for my license. They're like, no problem. We're gonna just do a behind the wheel test and a knowledge test and away you go. So guess what? What's gonna happen? What's gonna happen to people who don't have a car to practice with? What's gonna happen to people who don't have a mom and dad at home all the time to practice driving with? Well, they're probably gonna wait until they're 18, right? And that's indeed what we're seeing in the licensing numbers now. And it's having some pretty dramatic effects and maybe surprising for those of us who've been in the field of injury prevention and who I think felt and perhaps feel still strongly that graduated driver licensing is the single most effective injury prevention policy that exists. But is it good for overall health? And so I'm going to share some findings with you that kind of may reflect this. And so graduated driver licensing policies have indeed been, as I said, associated with licensure delay for young people from non-white backgrounds. And the delay for after they potentially could have become licensed and when they eventually got their license can be considerable. For Latino teens, in a nationally representative sample of teens who were surveyed, the delay was 3.5 years. Among African American teens, it was almost 3 years. And so I think the implication here is that these laws and these policies that were very well intentioned, and I think they still do serve a purpose, they disadvantage certain communities in different ways. And so to continue, not only that, but as I mentioned, there was kind of what was perceived to be a shift in licensing age from 16 and 17 to 18 and 19, where those policies no longer applied. And in that case, when this happened, there was an evaluation. This was published in 2011 in JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association. Is one of the most prestigious journals in the United States. And that indeed, stronger graduated driver licensing programs were associated with a lower incidence of fatal crashes for 16-year-old drivers. However, those same strong GDL programs were associated with a higher fatal crash incidence for 18-year-old drivers. And so when you dig into this paper, one of the most sobering findings of this paper was almost for every single 16 and 17-year-old life that was saved, an 18 and 19-year-old life was lost. And so this is the kind of the risk offsetting that occurred as a result of this policy. Now, this was a one-time point study. There were many factors that kind of may have contributed to this, but I think that we had to kind of take any single study with a grain of salt. But increasingly, there's a kind of an emerging literature that begins to show that these policies are having a detrimental effect on the older teens. Not only that, the effect is not equal. When we looked at factors contributing to driver license delay in the United States, effectively, the hypothesis that I presented to you earlier, that, if you don't have your parents around who can take you out and practice, then you're more likely to be delaying your licensure. If your parents' educational level is low, which is kind of a proxy for the level of income they may be earning, then again, you're going to have a licensure delay. And indeed, when you look at household influence, those from lower household influence were 4.4 times more likely to be delayed than those with high household influence. And I think when we think about this kind of policy innovation of graduated driver licensing, I think one of the questions that we didn't ask ourselves as a field in injury prevention was, at the time, this was a very well-intentioned policy, but the unintended consequences were not fully thought through or interrogated. And now, 30 years later in the United States, there is a new conversation happening about driver licensing systems that is beginning to take into account factors like access and equity and mobility, and the use of technology to kind of overcome some of the barriers that were created historically. And so, Lucinda, I'm going to stop my remarks here. I do have another case study to share that I mentioned at the beginning about a city policy, but I think in the interest of time and letting Sara speak, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. Sara, let me hand over to you.
Well, good afternoon. I will share my screen. Okay, hope you see it.
Yes.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity to speak about the relationship between transport policies and the opportunities available to rural citizens in Lleida. And let me start by saying that I understand politics as a public service to respond to the needs of citizens and to multiply the opportunities of the territory of Lleida. And this afternoon, I'll try to make a contribution that I hope it will be valuable to all of you, in the sense of raising awareness of the needs, but also of the potential of rural areas. And it's true that I'm used to making this type of interventions to urge action from the Spanish government in my work as a senator. And for me, today, it is a privilege to be able to bring this call also to the academy as well. So at the Senate of Spain, I advocate for the Lleida province needs. And as I will explain, we have managed to reach important agreements on certain issues, particularly on transport infrastructure, which is a critical concern for rural areas like Lleida. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Spanish Parliament, it is bicameral, consisting of the Congress of Deputies and the Senate. And I represent the Esquerra Republicana de Catalunya, and we are a Catalan left-wing party, pro-independence party, let's say. The province of Lleida, which you can see here on this map, is one of the 4 provinces of Catalonia, and Catalonia is a region of Spain. We are at the northeast part of Spain, and Barcelona is our capital city. Just to let you know the magnitudes, Lleida province has 12,000 square kilometers and 440,000 inhabitants. 30% of these inhabitants live in the capital city, Lleida, and they are spread all over this territory in 2,031 municipalities. So to let you know how population is distributed into this huge territory. And just to let you know that Lleida is a rural province with small cities, an aging population, and an economy largely dependent on agriculture and small businesses. And this rural character brings challenges such as the population. And every day, people in Lleida have to commute to nearby towns to access health, education, and leisure services. And at the same time, public transport schedules do not always adapt to these needs. And that's why the car in capital letters, plays a very important role in mobility in Lleida. So I would like to talk and outline the social impact of transport on rural communities. I will try to fast review the current state of infrastructure in Lleida, and I will try to illustrate these issues with personal stories, which are the stories that people in my territory that talk to me as a politician explain me, and I will try to end with some final remarks. I would like to continue by giving you some key data from 2006 Daily Mobility Survey. I know it's a little old, we don't have newer data available. A new survey I know is about to be done, but although this survey provides valuable insights into transport habits in our regions. As you may see, we are in here. This is the southern part of Lleida and northern part of Lleida, which is mountain, Pyrenees. Mobility in Lleida in weekdays is mainly done by car. And so private vehicles dominate. And the average car occupancy is very low, only 1 or 2 people per vehicle, and expectant because I think we will soon see if this has changed with the spread of car sharing initiatives. It's also interesting to know that when you ask car users why they are using their private vehicles, they say they have no alternative by public transport, as this survey reveals. And they also say the car is more comfortable and it saves time. And I would like to highlight that 41% of Lleida's population, 41%, do not have a driving license. We also see that going on foot is also significant, especially in smaller towns. Smaller towns in Lleida have walkable distances, and the problem starts when people need to move to other towns to get to the services. And as you may see here, the use of public transport is quite low. And you may, and I asked myself, who are the ones who use public transport? And the survey reveals that are mainly women, young people under 16 years old, that means students, and older adults. And public transport in Lleida is mainly bus and train, is poorly rated due to its lack of reliability and punctuality, and it's also cheaper than private vehicle. Just to give you some more context, the vast majority of university students in Lleida have to travel to other cities or provinces, and that may represent a barrier in order to access university studies for our students. And from all this data, several conclusions may emerge. I would highlight that for me, it is obvious that there is a gender bias in mobility in Lleida. Why? Because the dependence on private vehicle in rural areas puts women at disadvantage. Gender inequality and stereotypes had led many women, especially older women, to not having a driver's license. And in other cases, family units have only one vehicle, which is used mainly by men to go to work. And in addition, it is women who make trips to accompany family members. So here's how I understand that there's this gender bias in mobility in rural areas in Lleida. I also think that there is an economic barrier to car use. That's why we see young men of migrant origin, mainly workers, using public transport in Lleida, and I think it's the same case for students. And a large part of the journeys are made by car, despite of the car drivers recognizing that the main reason is the lack of public transport options. And I think there's another conclusion. I must say that as the age increases, driving mobility decreases. Driving ability, decreases. So all the people in rural areas get more isolated than all the people in urban areas when they lost their driving license. So I think for all these reasons, I think that promoting public transport in rural areas as a real alternative to the private vehicle is a measure in favor of equal opportunities. I will continue by explaining you that how's the transport infrastructure in Lleida. Let me start by saying that Spanish governments have generally not invested in Lleida's transport infrastructure, and the main roads, the train lines are state-owned in Lleida. So in recent decades, investments have focused on high-speed rail, leaving aside commuted rail in Spain, all over Spain. And there has been also an obvious over-investment in the Spanish capital, Madrid, leaving aside territories such as Catalonia, and within Catalonia, the rural areas like Lleida. And that's true for the roads, and it's also true for the railway. So let me talk a little about the road infrastructure in Lleida. The lack of investment in maintenance has been a constant on most state roads in Lleida. The most representative case is N260, which is this road here that goes east to west, crossing all the Pyrenees, following all the Pyrenees, the mountains. That's why it is commonly called as Pyrenean axis. It is a strategic route, and it has suffered years of neglect. And due to our negotiation with the Spanish government, 260 million euros have been allocated for improvements in this road. But we signed the agreement in December 2022, and not a single stone has been moved yet. So changes, we need changes, and we need they to be more fast, to be faster. So we have managed also to make the Spanish government to improve the asphalt of 50% of the A2 highway in Lleida, which is this highway you see in here. It's a strategic road that connects Spain and France, and every day almost 2,000 trucks cross Lleida province daily. So you can imagine the impact on the asphalt, and it's been almost 3 decades without a proper investment in this road. And I would also like to talk about the liberation of the AP2 highway toll. The AP2 highway is here. And after more than 40 years, it was a joy to have the toll liberated, but the Spanish government was not prepared for this situation. We now have this high capacity road underused for local mobility because new access points must be built, and we negotiated with the Spanish government, and new access points are planned to improve connectivity for rural areas. So this huge highway can be more useful for rural citizens in Lleida, but again, everything is going very slow. Let me talk a little about railway infrastructure. Let me say that minimal investment is also the main feature here. Few trains are running per day. There are daily incidents, delay, lack of information, and recent improvements we have achieved some recent improvements. We have there are more frequency on the Lleida-Manresa line. It has doubled. And it has increased the passengers numbers. So now we have the double frequency of trains. We have doubled the frequency of trains between Lleida and Manresa. In the first month, with more train frequencies, passengers increased by 30%. And this fact shows that when the supply of public transport increases, demand grows. But on the contrary, it is very difficult for demand to increase if there is no improvement in train frequencies. And this is our main point of disagreement with the Spanish government and with Renfe, which is the railway operator in Lleida. There is a lot of work to be done in Lleida so that the train is truly a transport option for citizens. And it has recently experienced a significant increase due to the drop in rates. Just let me mention one paradox, one injustice of two towns, Almacelles and Raimar, that luckily they have railway stations, but the train has not stopped there for years due to the mismanagement of the Spanish government, and I think that's a case incomprehensible. And what you see now on the screen is a map, sorry, of the different cities and towns that combines the different bus and rail lines that exist. We have a main railway here, another one who goes up to the Pyrenees, another that connects us to the coast with Tarragona, and the rest of red lines are bus lines. So with this network in mind, this could give you the image of a good public transport connection in Lleida. And certainly we start from a good base, but the reality is experienced differently by the citizens. And to show you how citizens live this reality, I will give you an example. I will mention an analysis made by el Consell Comarcal del Pla d'Urgell. Let's call it a county council from el Pla d'Urgell, which is a comarca, a county here inside the Lleida province, which you can see bigger here with the different towns. The capital city, Mollerussa, they are well connected by some state-owned roads, but also with local roads. And when we see how people from all those villages can reach to Mollerusa in order to access to some services, we get this graphic that shows the public transport connection of the different towns of the county, which you have them here. You have them here, different towns of this county, how they get to Mollerusa for work reasons, for education reasons. Oof. Sorry. I'll try to, about it. I'm sorry. I'll try to show you again. Here. Okay. So with this graph, we can see how different towns of this county connect to its capital, Mollerusa, where the services are. And like in traffic lights, you can see all towns are well connected to education needs at mandatory stages. It's all green. It means that people from Bell-lloc d'Urgell can get easily to Mollerusa for studying reasons. And you can see also that all of them is underconnected when it comes to accessing leisure. It's all red, orange. No, it's underconnected. This means, although there are public transport ways to connect to Mollerusa, as we've seen in the map before, those public transport options are not available during leisure hours. So when a person from Linyola wants to reach Mollerusa and go to the cinema or to the theater or to a museum, the schedules of the public transport are do not connect to leisure hours in Mollerusa. I would highlight this column here because it means the healthcare system. The healthcare system. So it is worrying that this poor connection with health services. It means that the existing options of public transport do not solve mobility for people who have to commute for health reasons. And although they have little consultories in each of these villages, they do need to look for greater doctor assistance in Mollerusa, and they cannot do it by their own means. They all need to use a private vehicle because there are no options available with public transportation. So it is obvious to me that there is a human cost of this inadequate transport system. And for me, the question is, what is the impact of all of this has on the lives and opportunities of people in this rural area? And for that, I would like to share with you the experience of some people that explain me their situations. For example, at my secondary school, one classmate had to give up her dream of attending university because her family could not afford the costs of relocating her to Lleida, our capital city. We are just 40 kilometers far away from the university. And 20 years ago, when I was 18, when someone wanted to study to Lleida University, it required moving away from our hometown. And the only reason is because this is a consequence of inadequate public transport. I wanted to show you also how the access to work is also depending on this transport infrastructure. A young woman from a village near Mollerusa, she told me that she depends on public transport to reach her job in Tárrega, and while she's committed to sustainable transport because she has no private vehicle alternative, she sees how the schedules are unreliable, and she often has to wait for hours, or she has to adjust her worksheets just because of the train failure, let's say. And I would also like to talk about older women in rural villages, because many older women in small towns lack access to basic services like grocery stores, pharmacies, or banks, and they rely on taxis if they can pay it, if they can afford it, of course, or they rely on the kindness of neighbors for these essential trips. And some of these older people in rural villages are forced to move to larger towns or directly to nursing homes simply because they lack transport options. So, to conclude, and it's not working. To conclude, the case of Lleida, I think that highlights systemic issues in transport policies that undermine rural opportunities. For me, it is obvious that we have had years of insufficient maintenance that have left our key routes and our key railways in poor conditions. The transport policies that we have seen often fail to anticipate changes in demand, as I said, in the case of liberation of tolls in a highway, in a specific highway. I also believe that when we increase service frequency and we lower the costs, we see how the demand boosts. And the question is whether we should wait for demand to increase, or if we have to proactively improve service in public transportation. And I think I've already given you my opinion about this point. I also think that in this case, we see how improved transport access enhances rural residents' ability to access healthcare, education, employment, and leisure. And also, when we have a look at anti-depopulation policies, we see that current policies like this integrated approach are needed to tackle rural challenges effectively. So I do believe that with better infrastructure and coordinated policies, transport can really become a powerful tool to unlock the potential of rural areas like Lleida. I think that the time to act is now. I remain committed to ensuring that no citizen is left behind because where they live. And I end up by thanking you for your attention and welcoming your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sara. Yeah, it was very refreshing to have new types of examples, especially examples coming from rural areas and other examples beyond those examples from Barcelona, for example, that are often used when we talk about case studies in Catalonia. So thank you very much for that very clear presentation, and thank you also to Johnathon as well for going into detail into the specific driving license policy and highlighting the impact as well that that specific policies can have on health and different social groups. And so thank you very much for your excellent presentations, both of you, very complimentary. I just wanted to ask if either of you had any comments or reflections on each other's presentation. And also, Johnathon, there was perhaps some other things you might want to raise, which you weren't able to discuss in your presentation due to time. So I hand over to you two for some joint reflections before we move to the audience and then see what questions they have.
Yeah, I would just echo what you said about Sara's presentation. I love the the personal case studies and the stories about the the specific ways transportation either can help or hinder access to education and opportunity. In fact, kind of one piece of my presentation which I had kind of omitted due to time is that the cumulative impact of those burdens that the current licensing system has for young people in the US is that it translates into very real outcomes. So young people who with delayed licensure, kind of mirroring what Sara shared, have a lower self-reported health, they're less likely to have completed a college degree, and they're less likely to have employment. And so I think this kind of the impact of transportation and access to transportation and mobility has very real consequences. I suppose that's what I took away as a kind of the harmonizing or unifying theme across both of our presentations.
Yes, and from my part, I would like to add that I find very interesting this approach you propose on people's health, not related to transportation, and I would find very interesting to have all this data related in Lleida, and hopefully more recent, because I'm working with data from 20 years ago, and I guess mobility has changed a lot. But I think it would be very interesting to know how this impacts on people's health, and I would love to have also this data to be able to have this approach, because I think we would find very meaningful information. And I also wanted to point out this this issue you talk about, when do we have to retire this driving license from older people? It's also an issue here. And because this means giving up the opportunity to be to be out. I don't know. I can't find the word, but
Independent.
Independent, yeah. Yes, independent, and this condemns people to go to nursery homes just because they don't have the ability to commute. And I think it's a very serious issue that we are not addressing properly from governments or from the parliament.
Thank you, Sarah. And I will, not to put her on the spot here, but my colleague Alicia Bain is actually has kind of a deep expertise and background on this particular issue, and chairs a group of people who's really interested in the mobility of older adults. So once they transition, as you said, Sarah, from as they transition from driving, how do you kind of enable them to continue mobility and unlock older adults' mobility after licensing has ended for them? And so I'm very pleased that she's on the Zoom with us as well. And thank you for joining us, Alicia. If you have anything to add, please chime in.
Yeah, and also if anyone has any specific questions about anything that's been discussed so far, or would like to share their opinion also on the topic. You can just raise your hand and open the mic.
I can go myself.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Varun.
Great. Thank you for your presentations, Jonathan and Sarah. And thank you, Sara, especially for the great work you do in the Senate. We know that the process of improving the railway services in Catalonia has often been involved very complex and tough negotiations with multiple stakeholders, including the Spanish government and the Socialist Party now in government. I wanted to ask, from your perspective, what do you see as the most delicate or challenging issues in such negotiations, and what lessons can we learn or can be applied for future efforts in transportation policy? Thank you.
Well, I think, should I answer now, Lucinda?
Yes, sure.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think the most challenging issue is all about resources, is all about money, but it's all about a huge state that has his railway connections by a radial model, and I think there's been a lot of investment in highway in high-speed train connections, and we have forgotten the ordinary rail that people commonly use to commute to work. So I think this is one challenge, the model, the railway model we have in the Spanish state. But I would say in our daily negotiations, when we try to improve frequencies in Lleida, so people don't have to wait so much time at the station, and really a train is an option to go and return, and you seriously take this option as an alternative to private vehicle because it's reliable, because it's serious, because it's punctual. So if you can take the opportunity to use train because you can rely on the train, we have this issue about the demand or the offer that I do believe and I do fight, because I understand that if we increase the frequencies, then more people will use the train because it will be more useful. Here we crash with this economical view that you only can put more trains if there's more people demanding trains, but this will not, I think that this doesn't work this way. You need to put more trains, and then people get used to these new schedules. They rely on public transport because it starts to be punctual, and then you get to increase demand. But I think it's very challenging not challenging. I think it's very no sé, no trobo la palabra una altra vegada, but I don't believe we will get more people to use train in Catalonia without improving the reliability, the punctuality of the trains. So for me, this is the most challenging issue that when we are debating. And of course, apart from research, apart from control of the important infrastructures in our country, because there's a will from the Spanish government to control of these infrastructures, of this transportation infrastructure, and also a Catalan will to administrate it by ourselves.
Can I respond to that just briefly, Sarah? And just to thank you for kind of summarizing those very real kind of policy and political and pragmatic questions. I would say the academic literature also supports your view, Sarah, that studies show that improving service frequency and reliability often leads to ridership growth, and that the ridership growth is kind of like proportional. So for an increase in demand, of increase in service of 10%, then ridership can increase by like 3 to 6% or something like that. So there's even ways to kind of quantify this idea that you articulated. And of course, there's it really does depend on the nature of the service. And I really also appreciated the point that you highlighted about the difference between kind of local and regional rail lines versus high speed. That are kind of really typically intercity, large metropolitan centers versus kind of regional rail, which is a whole different thing. And the same issues, I would say, exist in the US context.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, there's a comment in the chat by Lauri. She said she loved your presentation as it raised questions of your presentation, Sara, specifically with examples from Lleida, as it raises questions of knowledge, evidence, and data, as we were saying before, that there was an issue of being able to have having access to data, quantified data, and the question was asked whether you were using the case studies, for example, to illustrate your points, which I understand is yes. And Ave, I understand you have a question for Jonathan, if you'd like to ask it.
Hey, yeah, thanks. Thanks to both of you for your presentations. It was really interesting. I guess I was wondering, Jonathan, I've never been to the US, but from what I've heard and learned, I understand it's very, especially in the cities, maybe compared with Europe, it's very car dominated, and And I'm wondering what are the kind of discussions in the US at the moment in terms of in cities maybe trying to strengthen public transport and reduce the reliance on the car, because I guess in terms of equity as well, and like and you know, money being a limitation of maybe working class or poorer people and also racialized citizens, potentially like less reliance on the car would also help to improve equity in that sense as well, having not done any research on the topic. So yeah, I just wondered what your thoughts were in terms of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Eve. And I think you've really, I mean, it's a really big question, right? And I have my own kind of, there's like the kind of the policy and the evidence of what's kind of been happening. And then I have my own kind of lens through which I see this as also not being a native American, meaning in the sense that I didn't grow up here and I came here when I was older to study. And so I kind of see the country kind of also in light of my own experience growing up in Australia. Definitely there is ongoing and kind of vigorous debate about alternatives to car transportation. And probably the biggest policy kind of shift in the United States has come in the last 5 years, which is the adoption of a model for transportation called the safe systems approach. And safe systems is a philosophy around about mobility broadly, that is saying basically, you know, the system should accommodate all road users and protect all of them. The system designers have an obligation to create a mobility environment which tolerates human error and allows for multimodal transportation. So that's kind of like been the biggest policy kind of evolution, if you like, over the last five, maybe 10 years. And I think that has then facilitated infrastructure changes around making, for example, footpaths and bicycle lanes more prevalent in US cities. Would you believe there are many cities, and I've seen them with my own eyes, that don't have a footpath for pedestrians to walk, where if you want to walk, you're kind of ending up on the road alongside high-speed traffic, which is kind of a disaster from a kind of a personal safety perspective. I think in addition to that, so you could say kind of, and that policy of safe systems and the kind of the implementation of that was kind of then matched with a large amount of federal funds. So in 2020 or 2021, there was, you know, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act had $1 billion per year for 5 years dedicated to the safe systems implementation. So that's a lot of money, and you're kind of seeing that money now kind of get into the hands of the kind of the communities that applied for it and are doing successful kind of changes to their infrastructure. So layer on top of that then new modes of transportation. So you've now got a kind of a complete kind of efflorescence of anything with 1 or 2 wheels. I mean, you see this in Europe as well, right? There are these electrified bicycles, electrified scooters, bicycles themselves, and then everything in between. And so you've got this, you know, explosion of what we might call micro-mobility as well. And it's a controversial and polarizing topic because pedestrians don't like scooters, you know, drivers don't like scooters. Only the scooter riders like, you know, riding scooters, you know, and but they're serving an important mobility need, particularly for young people. And so I think there is kind of like this kind of system level change, and the new inputs into the system. What you're hearing less about is investment in public transit. And I think that's been the case for a very long time. Of course, there are some jurisdictions that are making investments and are trying to expand service and increase service and all of those things. But it's always kind of in the shadows, is my view. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I think the American psyche has this kind of unhealthy association with the motor vehicle. And I think kind of one of the implications of that is that the idea of using public transit is kind of like some sort of downgrade, and then there's work happening across the board to kind of change and reverse those things. And again, these are kind of what I would say are general views, not kind of if in different pockets in the US, you know, the views might be completely different, but probably that's enough. And hopefully a way to, you know, just an introduction to the answer to your question. And the best way, Eve, really for you to know about these is to come and visit and to see yourself. So I think that's really the only real solution.
But unfortunately, by not using public transport, it seems so. But thank you very much. We have a comment Laudi in the chat. She said, did in Sara's presentation, did she indicate a gender inequity in access to transportation? And I don't know, and she said specifically use an example thinking about Western Virginia, New Mexico. I'm not sure if Laudi, you would like to add anything to your question, either in English or Spanish. Or...
Sure, I'm going to add the comments in
you.
English. So I thought I heard Sara say that younger men did not have access to cars or transportation. And I wanted to confirm that. And then when Johnathon was speaking about the lack of footpaths or even sidewalks, if you look at places in the United States like West Virginia, New Mexico, even Atlanta, Georgia, you find a lack of safe ways to cross streets. You find a complete lack of sidewalks in rural states like West Virginia. And then my last comment was about complete streets. I don't know if anybody in this session knows about the Complete Streets movement in the US, but it's a good window on how the United States is trying to make changes in transportation policy that favors public transport and pedestrians. And I guess my last comment was about stigmatization of public transportation in the United States. Texas is a great example. If you use public transportation, you are considered low income. So it's just a series of comments, but the main question was for Sara.
Okay, yes, I said, I believe there's a gender bias in mobility, in access to car. Why? Because I think there's gender stereotypes took our great mothers, grandmothers, not to take the driver's license because women did not have had access to cars and women were not allowed to drive socially because they were caregivers. They had to stay at home and they didn't need to move with a car and they didn't need to have all that freedom, no, related to mobility, of course. And I think a part of this remains, and older women in our towns in Lleida don't have a driver's license, so they have their mobility limited by this fact of not having access to a car. And also when there's a car at home, normally is the man who uses it to go to work and return, and the women stays at the village, at the hometown, and commutes on foot. So I think that's the gender bias I was talking about. That's the main point I think, and I don't know if I understand you. You have also asked also about young men. I've talked about young men mobility. When I talk about the economic barrier, I think that that exists also. That explains why some people don't have an access to a car. And for me, there are young men of migrant origin, that have, on average, probably less resources than local population. Let's call it this way, because I don't know which is the polite form to say it. I'm not trying to offend anyone. But these young men of migrant origin are also users of public transport, also because they don't have the possibility to have their own private vehicles. So when we talk about rural mobility in Lleida, we know that car drivers say they don't have public transportation options to move, but I'm sure that the users of public transportation do not have a private vehicle option, and that's the main reason they say in the survey they are using public transportation instead of cars. I hope I've been clear.
Yes, thank you. I did ask who your immigrant populations are primarily there in your country.
Here in Lleida, they are mainly from Morocco. They come maybe from Morocco and other parts of Africa, because we are the agriculture sector is very important in our economy, and that means we need a lot of workers to do the harvest. We are our territory is specialized in fruit, peaches, apples. We are great producers of peaches, apples, pears. So there's a lot of migrant people working on that kind of work.
Thank you. I'm not sure if there are any other questions. I just wanted to ask, perhaps, Jonathan, at the beginning of your presentation, you briefly mentioned the Universal Mobility Allowance. I wasn't sure if maybe you would wanted to share a little bit more about that. Maybe it's not clear to everybody in the audience, or some examples of that being implemented in some context.
Yeah, sure, Lucinda. And just to to respond to Laurie, and who's raised some excellent points about complete streets also. So complete streets is often used as a synonym for the safe streets, or a safe system approach. So in a complete streets paradigm, the entire roadway system is geared to allow for all road users to be safe, including pedestrians, cyclists, and drivers. And so I think yes, Laurie, thank you for lifting that up and naming the Complete Streets efforts, which have been going on for some time. Okay, so with respect to universal mobility, the first thing I'm going to say is that this is not an area that I have kind of deep expertise on. Really, what I have observed is that a movement has begun talking about the need for people to have mobility as almost like a right, like healthcare. And I think that's interesting, because that hadn't been the case before. It was, if you like, the kind of personal transportation landscape was kind of like a personal responsibility. Whether or not you walked or took public transit or you drove was really on you. And so I think it's an evolution in the debate in the US, and some of the more kind of progressive cities have begun taking this on. And it looks different in different places. So there's kind of like universal, basic kind of universal mobility initiatives that can be modal specific. For example, I'll give you one example that actually I was going to speak to, but I didn't get a chance to. And that's just kind of like one very thin wedge of what is a much bigger kind of conversation that's going on. And I think this maybe also relates to the question about Uber and Lyft exacerbating inequalities that Eve has put in the chat as well. So let me just start off here. So let's think about these mobility providers, scooter and ride-sharing providers, as really entering the public space and entering a city or a region where they first have to ask permission from the policymakers if they can enter. Sometimes they enter surreptitiously, they come in, they start operating, and then people start using them, and then it's difficult to get rid of them. But typically they come in and they will kind of be working with policymakers on a license or an agreement to operate in a city. And so each vendor will come to the city. In this case, I'm going to use the example of Baltimore City. They had a micromobility role in their Department of Transportation. And this individual, who was kind of very kind of thoughtful, said, well, yes, we will take applications for micromobility vendors to come in, but we will review your criteria and then we will either approve or reject. And one of the criteria for you to enter this city is that, yes, you can deploy a lot of your scooters and devices in the busy downtown area where you're going to make a lot of money, but you also have to deploy 6 scooters in 10, like 6 in each of 10 or 12 transportation deserts across the city. So these are places where they're underserved by public transit, and they know that households in these areas of the city have low access to privately owned motor vehicles. And so one of the requirements or preconditions of scooter operators coming into Baltimore City was that they needed to distribute their vehicles into these kind of transportation deserts as well as the busy downtown core. And I think the evaluation of it is something that we helped the city of Baltimore conduct. And we asked people who use these scooters in these kind of transportation deserts, where did these scooters allow you to go to? Because typically we see people on the scooters kind of being young people who are going to nightclubs or bars or whatever it may be and kind of riding them after a big night out. But in fact, the people who were in these transportation deserts said they used them to go to do very utilitarian trips. They would go to the grocery store, they would go to work, they would go to the metro and then go on to other places. So my point here is that, I don't think kind of identifying the kind of the scooter providers or the rideshare providers as a kind of either putting them on a kind of in some sort of dichotomy, saying they either increase inequality or worsen inequality. My point here is that policy can direct them to address inequality. Now, yes, they may have some other effects also, but that's the role that policymakers can take, and they have to have kind of the muscle in order to kind of extract those concessions from them while they kind of make money in your jurisdiction.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I think this links well with another question for you, in fact, which would be the most effective policy reforms or community-based interventions for reducing transportation-related health inequalities in the US context?
Joan,
a broad question.
Yes, if I was Secretary of Transportation for the US, what would I do? Yes, I could tell you right now. I would, well, I think this is, I think remembering that the US is an extremely diverse country with a lot of different realities, even kind of Sarah's presentation about the geographical diversity of the region that she's serving is so different that there probably isn't a one size fit all. That's not to say that I'm trying to duck the question here, but I would say, the doubling down, I think, on making the roadway system kind of safe for all users. So doubling down on the existing investment in complete streets and safe systems is where I would begin. And then very kind of like in the same breath, I would say, making kind of historic investments in public transit, especially in urban areas, that doesn't address the needs of rural populations and people who can't access public transit because of their own mobility limitations. It's one thing to have a bus or a train, but if you can't walk to that train station for a different, that's a whole nother issue. But those would be the best, most effective, in my view, population-based interventions. But, again, I sadly haven't been chosen for Transportation Secretary, but if I am, I will put these in place.
Thank you. We still have a few more minutes, so I'm not sure if anyone has another question or any other reflections. Otherwise, perhaps we might be able to end there. So thank you very much, Sara and Jonathan, for your time and for sharing your perspectives and your insights and your experience with us. Thank you also to all of you for attending as well and participating with your questions. And also thank you very much to the team, the public policy team behind the scenes, organizing this event and all the other events as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucinda, for shepherding us through and getting us through on time, and your terrific questions and facilitation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.